Hello everyone! Today, I'd like to go over a budget commander deck that I built around Jhoira, Ageless Innovator. For this deck, I've kept the total price below $50, including its basic lands, using the prices listed by Scryfall. If you want to play with or adapt this deck, a link will be available in the description down below. Let's jump into it. So, our commander for this deck is Jhoira, Ageless Innovator. She is a 2/3 legendary human artificer that costs 1 blue and a red, and her ability is to tap and put 2 ingenuity counters onto Jhoira, after which you can put an artifact onto the battlefield with mana value less than or equal to the number of ingenuity counters on Jhoira. And oh boy, this can really bring out some massive artifacts quite quickly, especially when you start mixing in untapping effects to get Jhoira's effect off multiple times in a turn. So, the basic goal of this deck is to use Jhoira to effectively cheat out a bunch of really large artifacts and artifact creatures to give us something really impactful, either giving us a big advantage or being a big artifact creature to smack our opponents in the face. And we're going to use untapping effects in order to access Jhoira's ability multiple times in a turn, really ramping up how quickly we can bring out these artifacts. Now, every deck is going to need mana in order to function, and even though we're going to be using Jhoira's ability to cheat past a lot of our mana costs, this deck is going to need a decent amount of mana itself. So, let's go over our mana dorks and our mana rocks. So to begin, we'll talk about the Silver Mirror, Iron Mirror, and Palladium Mirror. These are artifact creatures that tap for blue, red, and 2 generic mana respectively, and because they have relatively low mana costs, they can either be cast themselves, or they could be the first things you bring out using Jhoira's ability. Next up, we have the Sky Diamond and the Fire Diamond. These are 2 mana cost artifacts that ETB tapped and tap for blue and red mana respectively. Then we have the Arcane Signet, which for us will tap for either blue or red. Then we have Mind Stone, which taps for generic mana, or for 1 mana you can sack it and draw a card, giving us a little bit of versatility. And last up for our mana rocks is Dreamstone Hedron, which is basically 3 Mind Stones in one. It costs 6 mana, but taps for 3 generic, and if you pay 3, you can sack it and draw 3 cards. Now, let's move on to some of these big artifact creatures that we'll be smacking our opponents in the face with. So, we're going to start off with Metalwork Colossus, one of my favorite cards. It's a 10/10 construct for 11 generic mana, but you're all but guaranteed to never pay that full cost. As this card reads, this spell costs X less to cast, where X is the total mana value of non-creature artifacts you control. And, as we'll get to later in this video, there is a lot of non-creature artifacts to reduce this mana cost, and if that fails, Jhoira can also bring it out herself as an artifact. Additionally, this card can be really difficult for your opponents to deal with because the second half of the card reads, sacrifice 2 artifacts, return Metalwork Colossus from your graveyard to your hand. You're going to have a lot of artifacts, you're going to be able to bring it back. Similarly, we have Gate Colossus up next, an 8/8 for 8, and this spell costs 1 less to cast for each gate you control. Gate Colossus also can't be blocked by creatures with power 2 or less, meaning it can't get chump blocked, and if your opponents somehow deal with Gate Colossus, you can put it right back to the top of your library just by playing a Gate land. Some other big creatures we have include Walking Skyscraper, an 8/8 that has trample and when it's untapped hexproof, Maelstrom Colossus, a 7/7 with Cascade that lets you play a permanent with mana value 7 or less, Combustible Gear Hulk, a 6/6 first striker that, when it ETBs, lets us put 1 target opponent in kind of an uncomfortable situation. They'll either let you draw 3 cards, or they'll have you mill 3, and if they have you mill, they take damage equal to the converted mana cost of the cards you milled. We have a lot of really high CMC cards in this deck, so if they choose the latter, they're likely to take a lot of damage. Next we have Bosch, Iron Golem, a 6/7 trampler that, for 3 generic and a red, you can sacrifice an artifact and have Bosch deal damage equal to that artifact's mana value to any target. Next up we have Sandstone Oracle, a 4/4 flyer that can give us a little bit of janky card draw depending on the number of cards our opponents have in their hands. Then we have Scuttling Doom Machine, a 6/6 that can't be blocked by creatures with power 2 or less, and when it dies, it deals 6 damage to somebody's face or a planeswalker. Accomplished Automaton, a 5/7 with Fabricate 1, meaning when it ETBs, we can either put a +1/+1 counter on it or create a 1/1 colorless servo artifact creature token. Blitz Automaton, a hasty 6/4 that can also be brought out for a discounted prototype cost at half its power and toughness. Then we have Meteor Golem, a 3/3 that when it ETBs lets us destroy any non-land permanent an opponent controls. Mirror Battlesphere, a 4/7 that creates 4 1/1 mirror creature tokens upon entering the battlefield. Additionally, When Mirror Battlesphere attacks, we can tap untapped mirror that we control and add the number of mirror tapped to the Battlesphere's power, and deal that much damage directly to the opponent or planeswalker that we're attacking. And finally, we have Cyberdrive Awakener, a 4/4 flyer that gives all our artifact creatures flying. Additionally, when Cyberdrive Awakener ETBs, our non-creature artifacts become artifact creatures with 4/4 power and toughness. Now, it's good to note that all of these are artifact creatures, meaning they can be cheated out using Jhoira's ability. However, some, like Maelstrom Colossus, require to be cast in order for their ETB effect to actually work. Additionally, due to these having some pretty high mana costs, we're going to need to get a good number of ingenuity counters onto Jhoira fast. And to do this, we'll make use of some untapping effects to make it so that we can access Jhoira's ability multiple times a turn. First up, we have Corridor Monitor, an artifact creature that, when it ETBs, lets us untap a target artifact or creature we control. This is great because, as an artifact, we can use Jhoira's ability to cast Corridor Monitor, use Corridor Monitor to untap Jhoira, and then we can tap her to put something else onto the field. However, Corridor Monitor only works upon ETB, where creatures like Vizier of Tumbling Sands, Kelpie Guide, and Fate Stitcher have tapping abilities which let us untap target permanents. And thus with these creatures, we'll be able to reliably untap Jhoira throughout the game. We also have some artifacts with untapping effects in Patriarch Seal, Puppet Strings, and Staff of Domination. Patriarch Seal can be used as a mana rock, but for 1 mana, you can tap it and untap a target legendary creature. For 2 mana and a tap, you can use Puppet Strings to tap or untap any target creature. And Staff of Domination is a bit of a Swiss Army knife of effects. You can either gain life, untap a target creature, tap a target creature, or draw a card. However, for this deck, we're particularly focused on that 3 mana untap target creature effect. Finally, we have the enchantment Return to Coral Helm, which has the effect of, whenever a land enters the battlefield under our control, we can choose to either scry 1, or, more importantly, we can tap or untap a target creature. So with this in play, we can untap Jhoira whenever we play a land. So with Jhoira and all of these untap effects in play, we'll be able to slap down a lot of cards onto the battlefield quite quickly. However, this also means that our hand is going to dwindle quickly, and we're going to need some card draw to avoid top decking. Okay, so first up, I'm actually going to talk about Artificer's Assistant and Crystal Ball. And while these don't provide card draw per se, these do give you ample opportunity to scry, allowing us to set the top of our deck either for our next draw stage, or for when we use some of our actual card advantage. This includes equipment like Goggles of Night, Mask of Memory, and Rogue's Gloves. Goggles of Night will let us scry 1 and then draw whenever its equipped creature deals combat damage to an opponent. Similarly, Rogue's Gloves lets you draw a card, and Mask of Memory has you draw 2 cards and then discard a card upon their equipped creatures dealing combat damage to a player. Then there's Parcelmere, a low-to-the-ground artifact creature that can be sacrificed for 2 mana to draw a card. Then we have Niv Mizzet, the Firemind, a 4/4 with flying that can be tapped to draw a card. However, whenever you draw a card, Niv Mizzet will also deal 1 damage to any target. Then we have Thopter Spy Network, which is a relatively fun enchantment that, at the beginning of our upkeep, lets us create a 1/1 colorless Thopter artifact creature token with flying, provided we have an artifact on our field, so we'll pretty much make a Thopter every turn. However, if any of our artifact creatures deals combat damage to an opponent, Thopter Spy Network will also let us draw a card. Next, we have Arcane Encyclopedia, which for 3 mana can be tapped to draw a card, Lore Seeker Stone, which for 3 mana can be tapped to draw 3 cards. However, this ability costs 1 more to activate for every card we have in our hand. However, this deck will also quickly drain your hand, so you'll be able to refill for relatively cheap with this card. Next up, we have a fairly new card, Tamio's Logbook, which for 5 and a blue can be tapped to draw a card. Now granted, that's a pretty awful mana cost. However, this ability costs 1 less to activate for every artifact you control. And given that this is an artifact deck, frequently you'll only be paying 1 blue mana to draw a card. Okay, and last up is Planar Bridge, which, admittedly, it isn't card advantage, but tapping for 8, it lets you search your library for any permanent card and then put it directly onto the battlefield, and then shuffle your library. Since you're using Jhoira to cheat out so many things onto the battlefield, frequently you'll have a lot of leftover mana, so you'll actually be able to use this ability not infrequently. And just think about it, You want to get a giant creature like a Metalwork Colossus out? You can totally do that. Is there a target permanent that's causing some real issues? Go dig out your Meteor Golem. It doesn't even have to be in your hand, you just take it from your library and slap it onto the battlefield. Okay, so now that we've gotten through the meat and potatoes of this deck, let's look at some of the additional synergies we can use to flavor it. First up, we have Steel Overseer, a 1/1 artifact creature that can tap to put a +1/+1 counter on each artifact creature we control. Considering the vast majority of our creatures are artifact creatures, this buffs the vast majority of our army. Next we have Reckless Fireweaver, which will deal 1 damage to each of our opponents every time we put an artifact onto the battlefield under our control. Next we have Loyal Apprentice, which lets us create a 1/1 colorless Thopter artifact creature token with flying and haste at the beginning of our combat phase, provided we control our commander. Then we have Dragon Spark Reactor, which, whenever it or another artifact enters the battlefield under our control, it gains a charge counter. And then, for 4 mana, we can sacrifice Dragon Spark Reactor, and it will deal damage equal to the number of charge counters on it onto a target player and a target creature. Next up we have Fire Shrieker, an equipment that grants double strike. Things will look pretty scary for your opponents when you have a 10/10 Metalwork Colossus that can bonk you twice in a turn. Next up we have Haunted Cloak, which grants a creature vigilance, trample, and haste. This will be very useful for when you want to get damage through onto a player and have a big blocker. Then we have Blade of Selves, which grants our creature Myriad. And as a quick reminder, Myriad means when this creature attacks, for each opponent other than defending player, you may create a token that's a copy of that creature that's tapped and attacking that player or a planeswalker they control. Exile the tokens at the end of combat. Or in other words, attach it to your biggest creature, and when you swing with it, you're swinging at everyone. Next up we have Manifold Key, which for 1 mana can be tapped to untap another target artifact, but for 3 mana, you can tap it and make it so a target creature can't be blocked for the rest of the turn. Next up we have Godpharaoh Statue, a little piece of stacks for our deck. This makes it so spells that our opponents cast cost 2 extra mana to cast, and at the beginning of our end step, each opponent is going to lose 1 life. Next we have Unwinding Clock, which will let us untap our artifacts during our opponent's untap phase. This basically means that our artifact creatures will have pseudo-vigilance and will give us access to things like mana, untap effects, draw effects, the whole gamut, since just about everything is covered by artifacts in this deck. This actually comes up to another important point. Jhoira's ability and the vast majority of our untap abilities are, well, abilities, meaning they can be activated at instant speed. This means that with a little bit of planning, Jhoira can effectively give our artifacts pseudo-flash. This can come in real handy with something like Platinum Angel, a 4/4 flyer that reads, "You can't lose the game, and your opponents can't win the game." Now picture this. You have Jhoira tapped, but a Fate Stitcher on your board untapped, and Platinum Angel in your hand. You've passed your turn on to your enemy, and they're swinging at you with lethal damage. What you can do then is tap your Fate Stitcher to untap Jhoira, tap Jhoira to add Ingenuity counters, and as long as she has 8 or more Ingenuity counters on her, you can place Platinum Angel onto the field before taking any damage, and then don't even declare blockers. You can take lethal damage, but you can't lose the game because you've placed Platinum Angel onto the field. Now moving on, Master Transmuter can do some really wacky stuff in this deck. It's a 1/2 artifact creature that, when tapped with a blue, you can return an artifact that you control to its owner's hand, and then you may place an artifact from your hand onto the battlefield. Or in other words, trade a small artifact for a big artifact. For example, let's say you have Sky Diamond and Master Transmuter on the board untapped. You can tap Sky Diamond for 1 floating blue mana. Then you can use that mana to tap Master Transmuter. Master Transmuter lets you return that spent Sky Diamond back to your hand, and then you can play any artifact from your hand onto the board. So let's just say you can play a Metalwork Colossus for that Sky Diamond. Then you can likely spend 2 mana, recast your Sky Diamond, and it'll be ready during your next untap phase. Now, what's better than 1 Metalwork Colossus? That's right, 2 Metalwork Colossus. And how do we achieve this? Well, we can do it through cloning effects. And what better clone than, well, Clone itself! Clone is a shapeshifter creature that can enter the battlefield as a copy of any creature on the battlefield. However, we also have cloning effects such as Sculpting Steel, which ETBs as a copy of any artifact on the battlefield, which means it can effectively clone almost anything in our deck, including our largest creatures. We also have Blade of Shared Souls, a new card with 4 Mirrodin, which means when this equipment ETBs, create a 2/2 red rebel creature and attach this to it. And Blade of Shared Souls turns the creature it's attached to into a copy of another creature that you control. Or in other words, if your 2/2 red rebel dies, for the equip cost, you can transform your smallest chump into a copy of your biggest creature. Now given how central Jhoira is to this deck, we're gonna wanna have a little bit of interaction and protection. To begin, we can use equipments like Swiftfoot Boots and Mirror Shield to give a creature hexproof. Mirror Shield additionally grants +2 toughness, and whenever a creature with Death Touch blocks or becomes blocked by this creature, destroy that creature. We can also protect a creature using Crab Umbra, an aura spell that, when you enchant a creature, for 2 and a blue, can be used to untap enchanted creature, already great for Jhoira, but it also grants Totem Armor, which reads, if enchanted creature would be destroyed, instead remove all damage from it and destroy this aura. Additionally, we can stop spells right at the source by using things like counterspells. And what better counterspell than, well, Counterspell. For 2 blues, it counters target spell. And for 1 extra mana, we can cast Stoic Rebuttal and Cancel, which also counter target spells. Stoic Rebuttal also has Metalcraft, meaning it costs 1 less to cast if we control 3 or more artifacts. Since we'll pretty much always have this, Stoic Rebuttal will almost always cost the same as Counterspell at 2 blue. Finally, for a little bit of protection for ourselves, we have Crawl Space, which is an artifact that reads, no more than 2 creatures can attack you on each combat. Finally, let's get to our land base. We're going to start with Evolving Wilds and Terramorphic Expanse, 2 lands that are basically reskins of each other, which can be immediately tapped and sacked to let you search your library for a basic land card, which you can put onto the battlefield tapped and then shuffle your library. Similarly, we have Myriad Landscape, which ETBs tapped, and for 2 mana, can be tapped and sacked, letting you search your library for 2 basic land cards of the same type, which then ETB tapped. Also to help boost our artifact count, we have Artifact Lands, with Darksteel Citadel, which taps for generic, Power Depot, which taps for generic, or it can tap for any color of mana, provided that mana is spent for casting artifacts or activating artifact abilities. We also have Silver Bluff Ridge, which taps for blue or red. Next we have a handful of gates, some of which interact with each other, and all of which can interact with Gate Colossus. Basilisk Gate lets us pump a creature depending on the number of gates we control. Cliff Gate lets us tap for both blue and red for this deck. Gateway Plaza taps for any color, but you have to pay 1 when it ETBs. Izzet Guild Gate taps for blue or red. Gone Gate makes it so other gates we control enter the battlefield untapped, taps for generic mana, or taps for mana of a color that gates we control can produce. And Heap Gate, in combination with an untapped other gate that we control, can create a treasure token, allowing us to effectively store away some mana. Next we have Temple of Epiphany, which taps for blue or red and allows us to scry when we play it. Rogue's Passage, which for 4 mana can make a target creature unblockable for a turn. Crystal Grotto, which also lets us scry when we play it, and can allow some color fixing. And finally, Tyrite Sanctum, which for 2 mana can turn a target legendary creature into a god in addition to its other types, as well as putting a +1/+1 counter on it. And then for 4 mana and sacrificing Tyrite Sanctum, you can put an indestructible counter onto a target god. This can be another good way of protecting Jhoira. And after that, we'll round out our deck with 11 basic islands and 9 basic mountains, cause this deck has a slight focus towards blue pips. Now, looking at the price of this deck, you can see that it actually rings in a few dollars under our $50 budget. Though it's also good to note that this price includes the price of basic lands at 10 cents a piece, but it doesn't include the cost of shipping. Though, if you're considering building this deck or others, maybe consider checking out your local game store first before ordering online. That all being said, thank you for watching. The deck list is in the description down below. Leave a like if you liked the video, and if you're wanting more budget commander deck lists, maybe consider subscribing. Thanks again, see you next time.